A very welcome to Campion Hall, Oxford, for the second of Father Marcy Darcy Memorial Lectures 2021. The Darcy Lectures are offered in collaboration with Georgetown University Press. My name is Minlib Dallh. I'm a visiting fellow at Campion. I would like to welcome all of those who are in Oxford, especially those participating in the Common Good Project in the Faculty of Law. I would like to welcome those at Georgetown University, and wherever you are most welcome. As you know, this year the title of the 8 lectures is Common Good, Theological, Philosophical, Political Aspects by Dr. Patrick Riordan, Senior Fellow in Political Philosophy and Catholic Social Teaching at Campion Hall, the University of Oxford. Last week, Patrick introduced us to the philosophical and theological sources of the common good. This week's lecture is entitled Reconstructing Aristotle, Political Philosophy. There will be time toward the end of our hour together for questions and answers. During the talk, please do post your question. Please make them short and crisp. Now, without further ado, over to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Minlib. Aristotle advises that the study of anything should look at the phenomena that seem to exemplify the object of study at its best, at its most mature and most developed, when it is healthy and functioning well. That is a normative approach and will be challenged, so it must be defended. But in our conversation, what should we take as the central case in politics? The most mature, the most healthy, the best functioning, given the great variety of forms of state and of situations. Any society must articulate itself for action in the world. It does this by developing roles and institutions with ways of making, adjudicating, and enforcing law. It will also have institutions to secure and defend itself. Given the dimensions of power created by such institutions, the society will have developed means for the allocation of power, its limitation and removal, since conflict about power, who is to have it and how it is to be used, will be unavoidable. These elements are present in the states familiar to us. But while they are useful examples for study of the nature of politics, none of them is perfect. While they may represent an advanced stage of development, I do not claim that they have achieved maturity or perfection. Remember the remark I cited last week. If I were going there, I wouldn't start from here. But there is no other starting point available. We begin where we are. We start from where we stand. And for us, that starting point is located in a society with a history that has articulated itself for action in the world in the form of a state. There are 3 major differences between the polis, the city, as Aristotle understood it, and a modern liberal democratic state. First, Aristotle thought that it was a shared view of the good, understood as a vision of fulfillment, which constituted political community. Our modern states don't think that, but something quite different, if not opposed to it. The espoused rationale of states that claim to be liberal is to facilitate citizens' exercise of their liberties and to manage the conflict between adherents of different visions of the good life. In these cases, it is expected that diversity and conflict characterize our modern states, and not harmony and shared moral vision. Second, Aristotle thought that the primary concern of the lawmakers in the polis would be the moral excellence of the citizens, because it is precisely the concern for the goodness and moral well-being of the citizens which makes a community political in the full sense, and not simply a commercial or a military undertaking. Our modern states reject any such moral task and confine themselves to the enforcement of a minimum as required to ensure order and security. Modern lawmakers would reject any suggestion that their concern should be to make people good. They would more likely follow John Stuart Mill's harm principle and insist that state power should not be used to restrict human liberty, except where the exercise of that liberty poses a danger of harm to others or to society itself. Third, Aristotle focused on the good life. His language was normative and teleological. He understood human nature as oriented to a completion, to some fulfillment. It followed from this that he took as a standard of action the best that could be done or achieved, in much the same way as an athlete today would measure her performance against the established records, or at least against her personal best. The language of contemporary political debate is more likely to be based on rights, understood as limits on what states may do to citizens, and not on the good or the best achieved so far. What should follow from this consideration of the three major differences, conflict as opposed to harmony, avoidance of harm and not promotion of moral excellence, and securing rights instead of facilitating fulfillment? One conclusion might be to withdraw all Aristotelian endorsement from the modern state and deny that it could ever be the locus of rational approval or loyalty in Aristotelian terms. On such an account, the modern state cannot possibly be the agent of the Aristotelian common good as the highest good, embracing all other goods. As pointed out in last week's lecture, I want to take Aristotle at his word in what he says in a number of key passages. These are that as action is for some good, so cooperation is for the good in common. Secondly, that there are as many forms of good as there are instances of cooperation. And third, that shared meaning and the capacity for reasoning are foundational. Aristotle remarks early in the Politics that it is the sharing of a view of what is good and bad, right and wrong, just and unjust, that makes a household or a political community. He insists that shared meaning is essential to the existence of a political entity. And because shared meaning is so essential to political existence, Aristotle also remarks on the capacity for reasoned speech as the distinctive human capacity, equipping the human for politics. The capacity for reasoned speech, for argument. That capacity is exercised by participation in any manner of deliberation about what is beneficial or harmful, just or unjust. Deliberation may be ongoing, but it is oriented to getting some answers. And adequate answers would be part of the common good of those citizens engaged in the deliberation. Let me put down a marker here. Truth becomes an issue once we reflect on shared meaning. This will be significant later when we consider an exclusive emphasis on liberty without the parallel concern for what is real, what is true. We start from where we are. We experience cooperation in its myriad forms, including political cooperation. Right now in England, we have local elections. Here in Oxford, we're voting for our city council, for the county council, and for a commissioner on crime and police. So let's reflect on these ways in which we cooperate. What are the goods that are pursued in common in these cooperations? What are the shared views of these goods, the shared meaning which sustains the collaboration? And how might we engage in the reflection on that meaning along with other participants? Consider Aristotle's point about sharing a view of the good. Is talk of the common good to be confined to communities of such a scale that all the participants can deliberate about their own goods in common? Or can a liberal democratic state with a large population and a market economy have common goods? Is it only the small-scale community, such as the Greek city-state with its restrictions on citizenship, which is able to realize the ideal? Alistair MacIntyre raised this question, and there are those who follow his suggestion under the title, the Benedict option, of hoping to find the small-scale community where they would have the possibility of identifying and pursuing common goods. Aristotle can be read as saying as much, but his texts also provide resources for considering the common good of communities which fail to measure up to the highest standards. The non-ideal cases do not appear in his examination only as examples of defect or deviation from the ideal. We should be able to identify goods in common, even in deficient and restricted instances of cooperation. The tools of common good analysis can remain available for the critique of the relevant restrictions and deficiencies, but also facilitate appreciation of the real good to be found in the cooperation. Among the good purposes which Aristotle identified, we can recognize many themes which today figure in the analyses of political scientists. Security, freedom from danger as ambitioned by mutual non-aggression pacts, prosperity as achieved by treaties ensuring trade in goods and services, covenants ensuring the guarantee of rights. These were as familiar to Aristotle as they are to us, but he thought that politics in the fullest sense would comprise something more. And I move on now to my next section, reconstructing Aristotle's propositions. Returning to the three major differences noted above, I will show that far from being irrelevant to modern politics, Aristotle's thought illuminates what is actually going on in terms of the common goods of cooperation among participants, citizens, and officials within democratic states. The first difference contrasted the reality of conflict with the harmony of agreement on what is good and just. However, even if we accept that government in liberal democracies is predicated on conflict, it does not follow that an Aristotelian analysis is irrelevant. To the extent that the conflict we encounter is managed politically, that is, by means which rely on talking and reasoning, the process of politics can be understood as oriented to finding agreement on what is good, just, and lawful, even though that agreement is still a long way off. One perennial basic conflict is the competition for power. Power needed if one is to pursue any good policy. To the extent that majorities and powerful interests accept the obligation to allow minorities to have their say, that they accept the obligation to provide reasons to the defeated why the chosen policy is not unjust, and the obligation to respect constitutionally protected rights, their position in power is not purely coercive domination. The acceptance of certain limits, the rule of law, constitutional constraints on power, and the myriad requirements concerning transparency and accountability reflect a considerable degree of agreement about the manner in which conflict is to be handled. The extent of the good on which we already agree is not as broad as Aristotle would have hoped for, but it is nonetheless a considerable achievement arising from a history of trial and error, of crises and problems. Adrian Vermeulen makes a similar point about the tradition of understanding the purpose of law in terms of ragion di stato, reason of state, seeing peace, justice, and prosperity as the goods to be achieved in law. The historical developments of the elements of the rule of law shows how solutions were developed to prevent the recurrence of problems already encountered. Operative in that history is a vision of what is just and what is good, a vision that is vague and never fully articulated, but finds concrete expression in the particular answers given to actual problems faced. So an Aristotelian can appreciate the forging of piecemeal and fragmentary agreement about the good and about the just, which sustains modern politics, even if it falls far short of the Aristotelian ideal. Mention of the adversarial system for managing conflict draws attention to one level on which political opponents actually agree when they endorse the democratic system for handling conflict. It is a system that recognizes the pervasiveness of conflict, but is committed to handling that conflict by non-violent and non-coercive means. So parties in conflict competing with one another to achieve and hold on to power, to implement policies and attain political objectives of change, nonetheless accept as among their common goods the democratic system itself and the rule of law as the political and legal framework within which they must carry out their conflict. However, as we can see in practice, not only is this agreement fragile, not to be taken for granted, but also the systems of democracy and law are themselves liable to hijack, abuse, and distortion. Capture of the regulatory bodies is one familiar form of distortion. Manipulation of the electorate through gerrymandering, through the redrawing of constituency boundaries. And complexification of voter registration, something we see taking place in the United States at present. These are present, ongoing threats. So these two aspects must be addressed: the vulnerability of the systems to corruption or distortion, and the fragility of the consensus about the value of the admittedly always imperfect systems of governance and law. Critical voices like those of Patrick Deneen, William Kavanagh, and the supporters of the Common Good Constitutionalism project with Adrian Vermeulen and Conor Casey have drawn attention to the failures of our liberal regimes. And there is no denying the facts of capture, corruption, and distortion. Alternative systems and solutions must be found. I hesitate to support any proposal that claims to be the common good system, where there is a tendency of some to say that the common good system will be better than what we've had. I say, to understand what we've had, we must learn to read it in terms of common goods. One reason for the fragility of our consensus on social order is that politicians and those involved in government do not spontaneously speak of these as common goods. So much of what belongs to an appreciation of common goods is actually implicit in political speech and action, but it is rarely identified as such. When participants in political debate point to elements of discrimination or neglect, when policies are critiqued as unjustifiably harmful to some persons or their goods, they are implicitly invoking the criteria of common goods as outlined in last week's lecture. The relevant criteria operative in such challenges are twofold. First, any policy which excludes specific individuals or groups from sharing appropriately in the benefits of social and economic cooperation is evidently not for the common good. And second, any policy which is detrimental to any dimension of human good, For instance, privileging wealth at the expense of health is not for the common good. Black Lives Matter is an example of a movement relying on the first criterion of non-exclusion of any group. Extinction Rebellion is an example of another movement that awakens awareness of neglect of an essential human good. It is reminding society that the pursuit of human goods of comfort and affluence is irrational if it thereby undermines the foundations of life itself. These examples should illustrate how common good concerns are implicit in our ordinary conduct of politics. These concerns can usually also be formulated in terms of liberal values, such as equality and non-discrimination. Let us learn to read what we have, to interpret our actually shared meanings in terms of common goods. We must be specific about them and not simply rely on a slogan. I'll be returning to this in the fourth lecture. So that was the first divergence, conflict, and not harmony. The second divergence highlighted above was that modern lawmakers do not have an eye to the character formation of citizens, and so do not conform to the measure Aristotle set for a polis. Once again, I take this as read, and again I suggest that an Aristotelian analysis is not therefore obsolete in this situation. One medieval Aristotelian provides a way forward. Thomas Aquinas remarks that the good is predicated in different senses, either simply or qualified in some way. A qualified sense of goodness is the goodness of conformity with the law's requirements. And a more complete goodness is realized when a virtuous character acts spontaneously in accordance with the law from a direct willing of the comprehended good. This distinction is sometimes made in modern political thought as the distinction between conformity and compliance. But this is not completely compatible with conventional usages of the term compliance. Sometimes compliance is also used just to mean conformity. Aquinas, following Aristotle, can confirm that the law's purpose is to make people good. And he qualifies Aristotle by noting that the attainable good in many cases is the minimal sense of conformity with the civil law. If they conform their behavior to what the law commands, avoiding those actions that are prohibited and performing whatever actions are required, people are, in this sense, good. This meaning of goodness is the only one which human law, with its instruments, can attempt to guarantee. The coercive force of law can succeed in effecting conformity, but it has no proper instrument for ensuring that the conformity springs spontaneously from virtuous character. The lawmaker can hope that habituation through the discipline of laws can lead to the formation of character, but she cannot make it happen. Implicit in Aquinas' remarks that at least the lawmakers must be virtuous. The lawmakers must be virtuous is the thought that no society that relied solely on the enforcement of law ensuring conformity could survive. The complete police state regulating and monitoring everything is doomed. Hence the incoherence of the phenomenon associated with modern political culture, that the identification of a social problem inevitably leads to a demand for legislation, that law is seen among the first rank of solutions, despite the fact that the only thing the institutions and officers of the law might be able to achieve is the prosecution of those who are caught violating it. Relying on officers and institutions of enforcement, courts and prisons that are already overstretched. For compliance with the spirit of the law and the achievement of goods intended by law Other realities are needed: virtue and character, acceptance of duty and responsibility, and above all, because our concern here is for common goods, above all, an intelligent grasp of the full range of goods at stake. From an Aristotelian perspective, it is noticeable that the lawmaking of our modern democratic states is oriented to the regulation of behavior in the greatest detail. The law specifies where one may and may not smoke, how fast one may drive, how one may or may not redesign or paint the house facade, who and under what conditions may become employers of other people, and so on. Think also of the excesses of consumer protection legislation, lampooned by Roger Scruton in his 2012 book on the common good, Green Philosophy: How to Think Seriously About the Planet. All these regulations are introduced for some purpose, deemed good and worthwhile by their proponents. But those who advocate and introduce the laws are motivated by something more than simply effecting material obedience. They have a vision of the good which they hope to realize by means of the instruments of the law. For instance, protecting the health of workers by prohibiting smoking in the workplace, protecting lives jeopardized by speeding traffic. This becomes articulated to some extent in the debates for and against some bill. The good indeed is what is at stake in the making and enforcing of the law. Although it is important to bear in mind Aristotle's caveat that people can be mistaken about their good. So while in the previous point I suggested that our modern political societies do operate with a shared view of the good, namely a minimum of agreement on how conflict is to be managed, here I draw attention to the way in which our various efforts to legislate result in setting standards to which citizens are expected to conform in exercising their responsibility towards others. The state's law does attempt to make people good, in the qualified sense sketched by Aquinas. While for Aristotle, the capacity for reasoned speech is the feature which equips humans for politics, he would have expected the debate to be about goods. While in modern political debate, the language of rights predominates. This was the third major divergence from the Aristotelian standard highlighted above. But again, there is a possibility of revision. Alistair MacIntyre has shown convincingly that various attempts to provide a philosophical grounding for rights have failed. He has also remarked how liberal political systems continue unfazed by such failure. How can this be? I suggest that the dilemma evaporates once we realize that the language of rights is not what it claims to be. Introduced to deal with the lack of a shared language of the good, it pretends to be an alternative, rooted in something incontrovertible and agreed. But in fact, it functions as it does to the extent that it is a way of expressing and protecting human goods. Consider, for instance, John Stuart Mill's rejection of any account of rights as rooted in human nature or natural law, and his utilitarian account of rights as grounded in utility in the broadest sense. Utility in the broadest sense, meaning the interests of the human as a progressive being. On Mill's view, rights are instituted in society to facilitate the development of the human individual and of society. Human law creates rights for the sake of some purpose. Those holding the opposite view insist that the law does not create rights as such, but recognizes existing moral rights and institutionalizes them. With MacIntyre, we can see that this debate is interminable, but perhaps we can also see that it doesn't have to be resolved. Neither position must prevail for the members of a liberal democratic state to continue successfully to use the language of rights. All it requires is that the rights identified and defended are sufficiently linked to genuine goods: human life, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, religious liberty. The debate then is about the good in the context of disagreement on the good, but seeking to construct agreement. Note that here I am not appealing to goods to justify rights claims, but arguing that the meaning of the content of rights claims is rooted in the corresponding goods. Professor Nigel Biggar's recent book, What's Wrong with Rights, both challenges my optimism here and offers a solution. Those who wish to bring all discussion to an end by appealing to their rights exhibit what Professor Biggar calls rights fundamentalism. He regards this as an exaggerated emphasis on the existence of rights prior to all enactment in positive law, and the preeminence of rights over concerns about public order and the common good. Biggar upholds an account of natural morality that acknowledges human goods, but also duties and obligations, virtues and common goods. Rights are not exclusively foundational, but among the elements of natural morality, they can mislead to an assimilation of legality to morality. And within the legal context, whether of human rights, constitutional rights, or civil rights, countering rights fundamentalism involves resisting any attribution of absolute status to rights, since they are all conditional on their legal context, on the availability of enforcement mechanisms, and the related goods of public order and the common good. Professor Biggar argues against natural rights as given or absolute. He suggests that when natural rights are invoked to critique legislation or political regimes, they can be understood as appeals to moral standards that obtain independently of positive law. A review of modern Catholic considerations of rights leads to a conclusion confirming Biggar's own stance. I quote, "The modern Catholic tradition of rights does display a superior ability to recognize the larger, multifaceted moral order of which rights are only a part. And it does recognize that morally justified positive rights are the socially contingent products of political deliberation about the common good." End of quotation. So in this tradition, emphasis on right order, as distinct from an order of rights, is characteristic. My suggestion is that within the Catholic context, rights are used as shorthand for identifying important human goods as aspects of well-being and flourishing. It is in the name of some neglected good that campaigns are launched to secure rights. This approach is not universal, of course, within the human rights community. For to the extent that rights fundamentalism holds sway and rights are grounded in an assertion of essentially unconstrained human autonomy, there is a fundamental tension between these two views, a tension well analyzed by Nigel Biggar's book. So have we rescued Aristotle? I've been attempting to offer an Aristotelian version of what we find in modern democratic states to provide a context for understanding the common goods of politics in a secular sense. Although the modern state does not exemplify the Aristotelian polis, it nonetheless can be appreciated in Aristotelian terms for what it does achieve. Despite its fundamental divergences from the Greek city, the modern state exemplifies the key ideas of shared meaning as sustaining political cooperation, the concern of lawmakers that participants in the political cooperation achieve qualities of character as shown by their abiding by minimal standards, and the purposes of cooperation as the many elements of the good for which people are said to have rights. Although diverging from Aristotle's own application of these ideas and his conclusions, my reworking of his analysis allows us to see the essential core of the modern state. At the same time, this use of Aristotle's ideas allows us to recapture an essentially modern concern, which is to limit the power of the state in recognizing certain limits to its competence. Although based on shared meaning, the content of that meaning is inevitably limited to what can be achieved in public deliberation among persons and groups whose comprehensive doctrines are diverse. Although aspiring to equip people for a life in freedom, the goodness of character it can effect by its own instruments is confined to conformity to the minimal requirements of the civil law. And although avoiding the danger of imposing a particular conception of human fulfillment on its citizens, the state nonetheless requires acceptance of standards for human behavior as formulated in the sets of human civil and political rights. The limits implicit in these positions allow the state to remain free from domination by any sectarian doctrine, even one of a non-religious nature such as atheistic humanism. While ensuring the independence and freedom of the liberal state, these limits also allow for the criticism of the state and its officers whenever they would attempt to overstep the limits and take on an inappropriate role for which they are not competent in specifying the ultimate good of humans and their societies, and in specifying the standards of moral fulfillment and moral goodness. Contrary to what Aristotle considered as the point of politics, namely the good life as the achievement of excellence in performance of distinctive human activities, both theoretical and practical, my argument points to the necessity of confining the purposes of modern politics. Explicitly religious concerns and theological content are to be excluded from the liberal democratic state's understanding of its nature and purpose. Of course, this does not preclude citizens and indeed theologians having a faith-based perspective on the state. It is simply that the state cannot include such a perspective in its own self-understanding and in its understanding of its own common good. However, the state is not compromised by allowing for the maintenance of other fora for the debate about the highest good and the pursuit of the unrestricted common good, even if these are not its proper business. I suggest that the above reworking of Aristotle's thought is compatible with what the Catholic Church has formulated as its view on the modern state committed to protecting human liberty and the Church's own relationship with such a state. This involves a recognition of the autonomy of the secular, as well as a commitment by the Church to renounce the use of state power to achieve religious objectives. That this development in the mid-20th century involved a radical turnaround in the Church's political understanding cannot be denied. The acceptance of the possibility of cooperation for establishing and maintaining the conditions for the flourishing of human persons and their communities is compatible with tolerance for diverse comprehensive doctrines. It does not insist on agreement on ultimate goods in order to engage in cooperation on more instrumental and conditional goods. Some theocratic positions take the opposite view, taking Aristotle's assertion that the good life pursued in the polis is the highest good which embraces all the rest. They filled their notion of the highest good to be pursued through the state with content from their religious faith. They conclude that the political authorities have a responsibility to pursue that highest good so understood. Then the authorities are understood to be obligated to bring about harmony and unity in society in the shared acceptance of this good, and to legislate so as to make people good and equip them for salvation. Not every religiously grounded position on politics is theocratic in that sense. Early in the Christian tradition, Augustine realized that the instruments available to civil authorities, typically coercive force, were inappropriate and inadequate to the task of making people good. In fact, he generalized his view that only God could make people good according to the divine standard of goodness, and hence that it could not be the responsibility of political authorities to make people good. This position receives a more nuanced reworking by Aquinas, who is reluctant to abandon so much of Aristotle. And so Aquinas can retain the insights of both his mentors, Aristotle and Augustine, by relying on distinctions such as that invoked above between the different senses of good. There is a perspective on the good appropriate to the state, which does not exhaust the human good and leaves scope for other agents and other authorities. In particular, since the interior attitude and intention of agents is a major dimension of their goodness or holiness, and this is not accessible to the instruments of the human lawmaker and enforcer, it follows that the human authorities cannot have the unrestricted common good as their appropriate goal. Their object is the domain of means and conditions, facilitating the pursuit of the good by persons and groups. The delineation of religious liberty helps to mark this distinction, since it specifies limits to what the state may do in interfering, either positively or negatively, with the freedoms of people to follow their religious consciences. Drawing on this account of goodness and of the limited capacities of the modern state, I argue against theocrats and against those Catholics who now adopt the position of integralism, that the instruments of the state are unsuitable for making people good and getting them to conform to the requirements of their religious worldview. Without wishing to consider the validity of the ends proposed, I concentrate on the inherent limitations of the modern state, which, both in Aristotelian terms and in terms of its own self-understanding, is not designed to deliver the kinds of effects which Aristotle and the theocrat hoped for. And so I come to the conclusion. Thomas Hobbes had denied an ultimate end, finis ultimus, or a highest good, a summum bonum, as the purpose of the commonwealth or state in his famous book Leviathan, 1651 or thereabouts. Hobbes definitely had Aristotle's politics in his sights as he asserted his great break with antiquity. Is it now the case that we must concede victory to Hobbes? Has the church succumbed to pressure and sold the past to the prophets of enlightenment? A fundamental distinction is required here. Of course, the teachers of the faith continue to uphold an ultimate end and a highest good for humankind and for all created reality. What they deny, and this is the point where there might be agreement with Hobbes, what they deny is that it is the business of the state or commonwealth to fit people to their ultimate end and highest good. Nor is it within the competence of the civil powers to specify in what that end consists. On this point, they had already learned, if not from St. Paul, then from Augustine, that the instruments available to the civil authorities could not possibly achieve the ultimate fulfillment of human beings. Will the debates within a pluralist society in a liberal democratic state never address questions of the ultimate human good, the ultimate common good? Of course, there are such further debates, aesthetic, cultural, anthropological, philosophical, theological, about what constitutes human well-being and human flourishing. And these need to be fostered and facilitated in the broader political culture of civil society, in institutions of education, academia, publishing, and the churches. But as argued above, the business of the liberal democratic state in providing conditions for flourishing does not have to await the resolutions of such debates. Its business can be carried on while allowing the debates to continue, leaving open the determination of what would constitute human flourishing. A liberal democratic state which attempted to fix policies according to one preferred answer to the questions about the highest good would be exceeding its proper limits and violating liberties. In practice, however, it is more likely to be the case that appeals to the common good do not invoke some ultimate good, but are holding public authorities to account for their failure to provide the conditions for the flourishing of everyone and every group. That failure can be due to a deliberate or unintended exclusion of some from a share in the benefits of social cooperation, as when some groups suffer disproportionately from austerity policies, for instance. Or it can be due to an imbalanced emphasis on some aspects of human good to the detriment of others, as when economic efficiency is measured only in terms of abstractions such as GDP, gross domestic product, or the performance of the stock markets. When institutions such as the BBC, the Football Association, and the various churches are found to have protected their own interests in preference to caring for the victims of sexual abuse, the criteria of the common good are also invoked. In such cases, the appeal to common goods holds the authorities to account for their responsibility in providing for everyone and every group the conditions for their well-being. Responsible politicians will not hesitate to accept the validity of the concept of common good and its criteria, even if they might wish to enter into reasoned discourse about the goodness of the disputed measures. The key ideas are the heuristic nature of the concept, pointing to what is only partly known and still in the process of being discovered, and the two criteria of non-exclusion of persons and groups, and the non-exclusion of dimensions of the human good. Next week, we'll be posing the question, is liberalism the enemy of the common good? The theme of theocracy will emerge again there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your exploration of Aristotle's political philosophy. Now we have some time for questions and answers. Please continue to post your questions as Patrick answers those who are already here. So the first question, can you please explain the protecting human good?
Explain protecting human good.
Yes, that's all.
Religious liberty is a particular case of a human good, the freedom that people have to exercise their religious allegiance, their worship of God, their freedom to assemble for religious purposes. There's a human good involved there that is recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and in many other forms of legislation. So there's the human good at stake here that is identified with religious liberty. Now, how do we protect religious liberty? We do it by formulating such rights as I've just mentioned, as in the Universal Declaration and in the Covenant and in national legislation, whereby a state commits itself not to interfere with the exercise of religion as long as it is compatible with not harming social order and the public good. So there's one concrete example. Many other examples could be thought of. For instance, family. Family and the relationships that are appropriate to family are human goods. And how do we protect family and the goods that are associated with family? Well, different jurisdictions attempt to do that in different ways by ensuring what used to be called a family wage, or that those who are charged with rearing and caring for children have assured income so that they will not be impoverished. They will be able to provide the basic essentials of nourishment, of shelter, all the conditions that are needed for children to grow up healthy. So I think those examples may explain what is involved in protecting human goods.
Thank you very much. The second question is paternalism and state welfareism supporting human flourishing or outside the limits of the modern liberal state?
One of the topics that I will be addressing later on is precisely paternalism. So perhaps I won't go into that at any great length right now. I think there is a whole set of debates within liberal political thought as to the extent to which a moderated perfectionism is essential. That is to say, we recognize that for someone to be able to, for instance, participate in the local elections that are now taking place around the country, they need literacy. They need to be able to read. They need to be able to in order to be able to participate equally and freely on the same basis as everyone else, they need to be able to read the programs that are on offer from the different parties and the independents, and they need to be able to read and recognize what are their own opportunities, what it is that they can do and must do if they are to exercise this right to vote, their right as citizens. So it matters in a liberal democracy that citizens have certain competencies and skills developed to a certain level. And therefore, it has to be part of the common good of a liberal democracy that a certain amount of what is called perfectionism, the development, the flourishing of people, will be the business of the state. To facilitate it, to provide the conditions for it, to provide the assurances and protections against the debilitation, the prevention of that kind of development.
Good. The other question, a little longer, but I think you could handle it. If one has a pessimistic view of human nature as being evil or in need or in need of restraint, is the reality of the law a better safeguard of the common good rather than hoping for the spirit of the law to influence the people?
Yes, I think in my fourth lecture, I will be addressing the question of political Augustinianism. And of course, this is the tradition that comes from St. Augustine, that he will want to say the human is by nature social. That's where its goodness is, in its sociability. But the political derives from the sinful side, the fact that the human has turned away from God's love, has sinned against God. And so as a result of sin, we are fallen. So in politics, we find the libido dominandi, the desire to dominate others. For Augustine, will is at the heart of sin, the assertion of human will over against God's will. Okay, so sin is the assertion of human will instead of God's will, instead of abiding by the will of God. So where I impose my will on others, that is at the heart of sin. But that's what the coercive force of the state has to do. It has to impose its will on others. Now, Augustine is able to say about that, isn't it wonderful in divine providence, given our fallenness, that the very elements that derive from sinfulness, namely the desire to dominate, become providentially the means whereby destructiveness and harm and the dangerous aspects of human fallenness are kept under control and limited in the harm that they can do to society. And what I was hinting at in my presentation was how Aquinas is able to take the very positive approach of Aristotle in thinking of nature as essentially good. Even with sin, with fallenness, nature is not corrupted. It remains good, essentially. But Aquinas is able to take that positive view and combine it with the more negative view of Augustine. And that comes out in the way in which he distinguishes between the directive force of law, pointing to what is good, indicating what it is good to pursue and what would be good to do. And on the other hand, the coercive force of law, which says, do this or else. And the directive force of law, of course, is addressed to those who are able to understand and who are motivated and willing to comply because they see the point. They value those goods. While the coercive force of law is effective against those who either want to rebel or don't understand or unable to understand. And so to them, it says, look, this is what you have to do. Make sure that you do it, because otherwise you're going to lose out in terms of something fundamental to your interest. That's punishment.
Right, let me just pick up this one who said, what is to be gained by Catholics from abstaining from articulating a substantive vision anchored on, say, the compendium of the social doctrine of the church?
What I am doing in these lectures and in my writings is presenting from the compendium of the Church's social doctrine, including from the broader literature of Catholic social and political thought, presenting how this can be implemented in the context of our modern pluralist society. We have to, as I pointed out in the very first lecture, we have our vision, we have our understanding of what is ultimate, God, but we also recognize that we live together with others who do not share the same vision, who might have other visions, or if they do share our vision, may see the need for different means and instruments than the ones that we identify. And so we have to find some way of working together, cooperating, collaborating, finding those goods that are common between us, ourselves and our neighbors with whom we don't necessarily agree on essentials, on fundamentals, but we can collaborate because we are humans together having to build a human society. And that is at the heart of Catholic social thought, as articulated in the Second Vatican Council and in all the popes since then, Pope John Paul II, Pope Paul VI, Pope Benedict, and now Pope Francis. So that's what the compendium of Catholic social thought is communicating.
Yeah, for the last question, I'll ask that question now. You mentioned power a few times, but don't you seem to make an issue of it? Surely power requires more attention than that.
I agree. And no doubt in later lectures, I will be returning to the topic of power. When I did physics in school, we defined power as ability to do work. Ability to do work. Work was defined as overcoming resistance, inertia, the resistance of mass. So an 8 horsepower engine could do the work of 8 horses in pulling logs or pulling weights, etc. In political life, in social life, social power is the ability to get work done by other people, the ability to get other people to do what you want them to do. Now, that power can be exercised because people that cooperate with you want to do it as well. They want to do what you're asking them to do, and so they cooperate willingly. Or there can be power used where those who are cooperating don't actually want or desire that which they are asked to do, but they have to do it because threat, coercion, force is held over them. And if they don't comply, if they don't do what they're told to do, they will lose out. Now, the question that I will be addressing in a later lecture is, how do we want to exercise power? If we're going to get anything done, if we're going to do any work, we need power. But what way do we want to exercise power? And how do we want power to be exercised in the societies in which we live and where we are citizens or perhaps subjects? But I will be returning to the question of power.
Thank you so very much, Patrick. On behalf of Campion Hall and our partners, Georgetown University Press, thank you all for joining us this evening. Please remember to register for next week's lecture at the same time, the same week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.